For everything there is a season, and a time for every matter under heaven. A time to be born and a time to die. A time to plant and a time to pluck up what is planted. A time to kill and a time to heal. A time to break down and a time to build up. A time to weep and a time to laugh. A time to mourn and a time to dance. A time to cast away stones and a time to gather stones together. A time to embrace and a time to refrain from embracing. A time to seek and a time to lose, a time to keep and a time to cast away. A time to tear and a time to sow, a time to keep silence and a time to speak. A time to love and a time to hate, a time for war and a time for peace. What gain has the worker from his toil? I have seen the business that God has given to the children of man to be busy with. He has made everything beautiful in its time. This Bible passage is one that's often chosen for funerals and memorials. It talks about the frailty of life, seasons of time, and our mortality. And it's kind of hard wrapping our mind around those topics, huh? Time and mortality. They're big concepts. You know, what would it look like to have an app, kind of like the health and fitness app, but it was like a time and mortality app? And it would have like a real-time countdown. Imagine maybe for the third time this week you've ordered pizza and chicken wings, and all of a sudden you get a little ding and you get a reminder on the phone, and it's like, ooh, man, the countdown clock just kind of sped up a little bit and I just lost some time. Or on the positive end, maybe you got into a really good workout routine, and for the third, fourth, or maybe fifth time you've gone for a jog or done a really good workout, and you get ding, and sure enough, on the app it's shown that you've gained some time. You know, that'd be all good, but then what do you do? How do you account for accidents and illness? Like, imagine you're maybe walking across a street and you're maybe looking at that countdown app, and all of a sudden the countdown stops just as you're hit by a truck or a bus. Can't really account for accidents. And then what about illnesses? Let's say you wake up one morning and all of a sudden you feel like, man, I feel like my countdown app, my time and mortality app maybe there's something wrong because I'm starting to lose time here and I don't know why. You go to the doctor, you find out you've been diagnosed with cancer. And now, all of a sudden, that time and mortality app, you are obsessed with it because you want to try to find every remedy, every treatment. You're trying to do things and watching to see how it'll impact, maybe watching what you eat, or maybe there's certain superfoods that'll help against the cancer cells. And now, all of a sudden, you're bound to that time and mortality app, just trying to get the time. Do everything you can to try and extend it. When you think about it that way, maybe it's best that we don't know. Maybe it's best that there's not a time and mortality app. There was a king in the Bible named Solomon. He prayed and asked God for wisdom. God was so impressed by his request for wisdom instead of wealth or a vast kingdom. God gave him wisdom. The Bible says that Solomon had wisdom greater than anyone before and anyone would come after. But God also granted him wealth and a vast kingdom, honor, royalty, and popularity. And with that, Solomon went on a search for life's knowledge and wisdom, but also a search for life's experiences. And then he wrote the book of Ecclesiastes, a memoir of sorts. After his search and all of his experiences, he lays out, hey, here's what I found out about life. It's all part of our series called Make It Count. If you only had today, how would you make it count? And in chapter 3, we get into life and mortality and the seasons of life, the frailty of life, and the seasons of time. And after he gives this poetic moment that is often read at funerals, he unpacks it a bit. He starts to come to a few conclusions, or what he believes we can know about the seasons of time. In verse 10, he writes, I have seen the business that God has given to the children of man to be busy with. He has made everything beautiful in its time. Also, he has put eternity into man's heart, yet so that he cannot find out what God has done from the beginning to the end. It's not often that Solomon comes to conclusions. In the first two chapters, we actually found that he's always talking about vanity, or the Hebrew word havel for vapor or breath, futility, meaninglessness, that really life's just going to be gone and it's hard to come to conclusions. He leaves us hanging, but in this moment, he almost answers the questions a little bit. He talks about eternity being written on man's heart, that we know somehow God's placed it there, that we know there's more. But it's also interesting that he also adds that people try to figure it all out. They try to figure out God from the beginning, the end. The Bible talks about the Alpha or Omega, and they can't really come to any conclusions. That it's like this ongoing search. But then Solomon does something interesting. He provides two perceptions. He says, I perceive, and he talks about two things, one related to us as human beings and one related to God. The first one he says is, the first perception is that the works of humanity are a gift. The works of humanity are a gift. He writes, starting in verse 12, he says, I perceive that there is nothing better for them than to be joyful and to do good as long as they live. Also, that everyone should eat, drink, and take pleasure in all his toil. This is God's gift to man. You know, we want to maybe focus on the concept of eat, drink, and take pleasure. Maybe you've heard it in your translation. It might be written, eat, drink, and be merry. We love that part. And even if you look at chapter 2 of Ecclesiastes, he talked about all the pleasurable experiences, and you might almost think, hey, you know, eat, drink, be merry, take pleasure, have as many experiences as you want, and that's the goal of life. Just make sure you're happy. As long as you're happy and you're taking care of self and self-care and valuing self and your own self-experiences, then that's it. That's life. But remember, in chapter 2, he said that's vanity. It's fleeting. It's a vapor that's gone. But here, in what he perceives, he says that there's a first piece. There's like a precursor. And it's to be joyful and to do good works. And then there's a semicolon, which moves into eat, drink, and take pleasure. You know, this week, I heard about a guy by the name of Cornell Dickey Charles. And he was from New Orleans, Louisiana. And Cornell was known and loved by his family. He had a wife, Nicole, and 2 daughters. He attended church regularly and was involved in church. But he was also very active in his community. He was an advocate for his community. Get this, every single Sunday afterwards, he would come back to his home and he would cook a massive lunch. And he would open up the doors and anyone in the community could come and eat. He was known as the king of the kitchen. It's New Orleans, right? So there was gumbo and seafood and those cold salads. And he was also known to make meatballs the size of baseballs. People called them mini meatloafs. Every Sunday after church, he'd feed whoever would come. And you know, it's interesting, he totally did that. He chose this joyful good work and service to this greater community. And then he ate, drank, and took pleasure as everyone every Sunday just took part in what he had served them. But it didn't stop there. He was also a part of a charity. And Dickey and other people in this charity would raise money for low-income families in the inner city that maybe lost a loved one. And they would provide what they called a dignified funeral. That even if you didn't have the cost for burial and all those other costs that are incurred when someone passes away, that this charity would step in and provide that so that you could send off your loved one and in, like they said, a dignified way. But this charity also provided scholarships and mentorship and food drives. Dickey was an amazing advocate for his community. He seemingly loved God and loved his neighborhood, loved his church. They had a big charity event right around Mardi Gras. And they were raising money for their charity. And a few days after this big event, he started to feel ill. he got sick, and his wife, Nicole, immediately took him to the hospital. He was going down fast. Dickie would be put on a ventilator but wouldn't come off. At 51 years old, he would die of complications and pneumonia related to COVID-19. And in fact, 30 members of that charity would come down with and get infected with COVID-19 and complications related to coronavirus. 8 out of that 30, including Dickie, would pass away. You know, after that, I heard in this report about his life that they had a funeral for him, but could only have 10 people because that was the restriction, and they live streamed it. But even though there was only 10 people at his funeral, over 600 people attended the live stream. And I got to hear some audio of that live stream, and people were singing, these 10 people, and there was one guy leading the singing, and they were singing out, "I will trust in the Lord." This chorus just resounded and rang out again, "I will trust in the Lord." And they were interviewing his wife, Nicole, and she said this one statement that just rocked me. She said, "God didn't choose me, so now I'm going to have to maneuver within this new life. God didn't choose me, so now I'm going to have to maneuver in this new life." You know, that statement, "God didn't choose me," she's not talking about God didn't love her, or she didn't belong to God, or that God wasn't taking care of her. She's specifically saying, you know what? God took Dickie home, but he left me here. It's so interesting, isn't it? It's like back to what Solomon says. It's, you know, be joyful, do good works, and then eat, drink, and take pleasure. And this is God's gift. And somehow the people in that funeral saying, "I will trust in the Lord," they got it. Somehow Dickie's wife, Nicole, got it, you know, saying, you know, God didn't choose to bring me home, so I'm going to maneuver now, and I'm going to adjust to my new life. God still got something for me. He still left me here for a reason. And maybe this whole story bothers you deeply. Maybe you're like, you know, you're struggling understanding the Bible and Christianity, and maybe you're skeptic, and you, as a skeptic, you're just like, this is why it's difficult. Why wouldn't God step in and save him? Surely a guy that is so active in his church family, so active in his local community, active in his charity, he is impacting people. And the 7 other people that are a part of his charity. These are folks that are impacting the world, doing good. Why would God bring him home? Why wouldn't God step in and just save him? It's a mystery, isn't it? But maybe that's not what bothers you most. Maybe it's how his church family responded, proclaiming that they trust in the Lord. Maybe it's how his wife responded, saying, "I'm just going to have to maneuver. God didn't choose to take me home." That she's okay with that. Maybe that's what bothers you. Well, it's interesting that Solomon, in his next perception, in the thing he perceives next about God, kind of answers some of those questions. He perceives next that the works of God endure forever. The works of God endure forever. In verse 14, he writes, "I perceive that whatever God does endures forever. Nothing can be added to it, nor anything taken from it. God has done it, so that people fear before him. That which is already has been, that which is to be already has been, and God seeks what has been driven away." What Solomon's speaking to here is God's ultimately in control. The things that God does in this world and beyond last forever. That the work God does within his timeline, not ours, it lasts forever. And he's ultimately sovereign. He's ultimately in control. And this is some of what I think Dickie's wife and Dickie's church family, I think that's what they were focused on. They understood that there was a bigger story being told. There was a way longer timeline than just their tiny life. For those of us that are a part of Christianity, follow Jesus, a part of the church, his church, we've actually had kind of a tough week. You may have heard of, if If you've followed any sort of apologetics in Christianity, defense of the church, defense of the Bible, there's a man by the name of Ravi Zacharias that passed away earlier this week. He was a great evangelist, speaker, author, pastor, and apologist. He was constantly traveling the world, defending Jesus, defending the Bible, and proclaiming the good news or the gospel of Jesus Christ. I had an opportunity to read through his obituary this week, and there was one account in the obituary that just made me think of Solomon's words and made me think of God's timeline. And I felt it important to read a portion of Ravi Zacharias' obituary because it's so fitting to what we're talking about today. Zacharias' passion and urgency to take the gospel to all nations was forged in Vietnam. Throughout the summer of '71, Zacharias, only just 25, found himself flown across the country by helicopter gunship to preach at military bases, in hospitals, and in prisons to the Viet Cong. Most nights, Zacharias and his translator, Hien Pham, would fall asleep to the sound of gunfire. On one trip across remote land, Zacharias and his travel companion's car broke down. The lone Jeep that passed ignored their roadside waves. They finally cranked the engine to life and set off, only to come across that same Jeep a few miles on, overturned and riddled with bullets. All 4 passengers dead. He later said of this moment, "God will stop our steps when it is not our time, and He will lead us when it is." God will stop our steps when it is not our time, and He will lead us when it is. Ravi understood what Solomon was kind of pointing to. God's timeline is so much greater than ours. In that moment, it might have seemed a hassle that Jeep broke down, but that God was saving him for a purpose, that there was a bigger plan in place. And he understood that his life weaved within God's sovereignty in the greater plan. Because at 25 years old, if Ravi had passed away, think about the impact. He died at 74, and between 25 and 74, he would travel the world telling so many people about God, about Jesus, visiting so many countries where hundreds of thousands, if not millions, would come to know God through his son Jesus because Ravi lived that day. And Ravi knew it. He said God might stop us and end our life, but He might lead us and lead us on in this life for a purpose. Each one of us has a purpose within the grander story. You have a purpose. I have a purpose. There is a reason you exist today, and He has a plan for you, but we have to submit ourselves to it and understand what Solomon said, that the work of God endures forever, and we can be a part of it. Like we've talked about throughout this series, Jesus finishes the story that Solomon started. Because Ecclesiastes is just one part of the Old Testament, and it all points to the New Testament, to when God would save humanity, that humanity dead in our sin and trying to maybe work our way to Him or earn our way to Him, that's not going to work. And so He sends His Son Jesus, and we read about that in the New Testament. Jesus finishes the story that Solomon started. And let's just take a moment and think about Jesus' life. Think about it in relation to this whole concept of time and mortality. He broke it numerous times. Think about his healings. If he healed a blind man, that blind man in the first century was probably a beggar. He couldn't work. What was his life worth? What was his health like? How could he get food and nutrition in any way? And yet Jesus comes along, heals his eyes, he can see, he can now work, maybe he can get married, raise a family. His life totally changes. His full well-being, maybe if he had one of those time clocks, it would be extended because of Jesus. Think about the paralyzed man whose friends loved him so much that lowered him through the roof of a house while Jesus was teaching. And they couldn't get to him, and they needed to get their friend to him because they knew that if Jesus saw him, he could heal him. And so Jesus, sure enough, heals this man. Goes from being sick and paralyzed to now he can work, he can live. The same thing, his life probably extended. Even greater than that, think about the prostitute surrounded by Self-righteous people, religious leaders, stones in hand, ready to kill her. Her life was over because they just thought she was trash. Jesus steps into her timeline, to her mortality, speaks to them all, if you don't have sin, go ahead and throw a stone. Suddenly they all start throwing down their stones because they realize, and they leave. And she's shocked. He stepped into her timeline and saved her, extended her life considerably. He says, go, sin no more. You've got a second chance at life. It gets better still. We read about in the New Testament, in the Gospels, that Jesus enters this house and everyone's in mourning. Sorrow, grief, girl lying in the bed, lifeless. And Jesus says, she's just asleep. Can you imagine? But then he goes over and he whispers to the girl, hey, sweetheart, get up. It's time to get up. In that moment, life enters her body. Jesus gives it back. There's even a greater story still. Jesus had a good friend named Lazarus. We read about it in John 11. And he was off teaching, performing miracles, doing the work that God had given him. And while he was gone, Lazarus was sick and he died. And they buried him. He was actually buried for 4 days when Jesus finally shows up. The family, they're wrecked. And they say, Jesus, if you had just shown up earlier, you would have been able to save him. They knew that he had the power. And Jesus looked at them all. He's filled with great sorrow. He's just broken. And he's weeping. And he's asking, okay, where have you laid the body? They go over to the tomb. And he says, roll away the stone. And Lazarus' sister begs him not to. He says, no, you don't understand, Jesus. There's going to be an odor. He's been dead for 4 days. You know, the body's decaying. You can't just open this tomb. Think about what they've been through, and this would just be further torture for them and their loss. And Jesus says, roll away the stone. And then he yells into the tomb, Lazarus, come out. And in Jesus' own grief and sorrow of losing his friend, and yet knowing the power that he can possess and that he can have to raise Lazarus, sure enough, Lazarus walks out of the grave, and Jesus tells them, take off his bandages. Take off the wrapping, because he had been fully embalmed. He'd been fully prepared, dead, buried. And so he's still wrapped up with that stuff. And so they remove it. And sure enough, Lazarus is alive after 4 days in the grave. Why did Jesus mourn? Why was he so filled with sorrow and grief if he could have just saved Lazarus earlier? Why didn't he come 4 days earlier? What was the point of that? What was the purpose? There's an author, Justin Holcomb, and he writes about this scenario. And always triumphant and so incredibly strong and sure of his own faculties, we see the Lord Jesus himself in his weeping time. In every time and season under heaven, there he is. In order to fully enter into our human condition, Christ had to experience all the times and seasons we do. And that meant enduring a time of sadness and loss. Maybe you've lost a loved one, a good friend, maybe COVID-19 even. We've been blessed here in the Yukon. We've not experienced any deaths related to COVID-19, but we know that that's not the case across our country and across the world. Many have lost loved ones early. Jesus knows your loss. He's experienced loss, and he can comfort you. The greatest moment in the Gospels is when Jesus conquers the whole timeline, all mortality, and it reverberates into eternity. And this is the moment when his own death on the cross took place for the payment and the punishment of our sin. The wrong you've done and I've done and everyone has done, the things that separate us from a holy God and access to the Father where we can never attain it, that God's plan to send his son Jesus to take that punishment for our sin, that was fulfilled at the cross, and God the Father turning away as his son took that payment and died. and they buried him. But he didn't stay dead. 3 days later, shocking the world in that time and continuing to shock the world as the account of Jesus' resurrection reverberates through God's timeline, not ours, that through the power of God and his Spirit and the power of Jesus, he defeated death. He conquered his own death, rose from the dead, leaves the tomb. Before Jesus came to raise Lazarus from the dead, he said this. In John 11:25 and 26, he said, I am the resurrection and the life. Whoever believes in me, though he die, yet shall he live. And everyone who lives and believes in me shall never die. That's the moment when God just shattered time, split time, and made a way for every single man, woman, and child to access him through his son Jesus. And Jesus says, if you believe in me, though your earthly body may pass away, your soul will not, and it will enter heaven to be in the glory of Jesus. That same author, Justin Holcomb, he writes about this. Mortality is decreed by God and is universal. Whether we like it or not, death is inevitable. And because of the fall, it is a judgment from God. But much like futility, death is neither an original nor a permanent feature of human life. Because mortality was ultimately conquered at the cross, our future dwelling with God will last for eternity. That is so true. And this really points back to what Solomon was originally saying about eternity being written on our hearts. Something that calls us to keep pursuing beyond this life and asking big questions. And at the cross, Jesus answers the question. He says that the thing that is separating you from God is I'm taking it. And if you follow me, you believe in me, then the power of the resurrection can be in you. Let's say you did have that app, that timeline, that time and mortality app. And let's say you looked at the app and you opened it up and you only had today. 12 midnight, time runs out. How would you make today count? What would you do differently? Knowing that tomorrow you are going to wake up on the other side of eternity. What decision would you make today to secure your future? Did you accept Jesus as the way, the truth, and the life, or did you reject him? In that moment, what will we say? And if we just had today, what would we choose? What would you choose? Today, you can choose Jesus. You can believe in the resurrection and that one day you will be raised from the dead. Your soul will enter eternity in heaven. If you would like to choose Jesus today, if you would like to accept Jesus, I'm going to pray and give you an opportunity to do that. And for those of us that have been living life maybe a little bit too much on the eat, drink, and be merry, take pleasure moment, and we forgot about choosing joy and doing good works, this is an opportunity for us to reset as well. Let's pray. Dear Jesus, I know that I'm a sinner, and I know that that sin has separated me from you, and I take too much delight in my own experiences and my own pleasure. And though you've given pleasure as a gift, may I not forget that I need to choose joy and do good works as well. Father, today I choose to follow Jesus. I choose to believe in the death on the cross for my sin and the resurrection, that empty tomb that has conquered death, conquered my death and my sin. Send your Holy Spirit to my life to encourage me and convict me. Help me follow your Son Jesus' example. Jesus, I thank you for taking my sin to the cross, and I thank you that you rose from the dead to conquer it. And it's in your name I pray.